Well, by the way, I've got some handouts. They're back there in the box. You'll need this because you'll be real frustrated listening to me without my handouts. Yes, that'd be great. Be great. I definitely need to start that. Well, Jimmy just painted this bleak picture of sin and darkness in the church. And it's very good that he did, by the way. That was wonderful presentation. My, so helpful. And then these case studies just stirred up a bunch of trouble. And now I'm supposed to be real positive and tell you how to breathe new life into established churches. Well, you can't. Can't be done. You can't breathe new life into established churches. I don't know why you're here for that. You know, we just... The only way to do it is with CPR, you know. Well, you know, there are a whole lot of people in this room who could make this presentation. I mean, there really are. I mean, Everett could make this presentation. Harold Shank could make this presentation. Randy Willingham could make this presentation. And, you know, any number of you in here could do it. Some of you who've had a lot of experience in revitalizing established churches. Established churches have really been my life. I've never planted a church. I was part of a full-time ministry in an established church that was only 7 years old at one point. But all those people came from established churches and just sort of moved out to another area of Memphis. And, you know, it was an easy church plant. They just didn't go much beyond that little group of people who had started it way out in old Cordova there in Memphis. And I went there, and that was my, that was a wonderful ministry. And that was a church of 80 members. During the time that I was preaching part-time all the way through my undergrad work at both Freed-Hardeman and Lipscomb, I preached at churches from 15 members to 30 or 40 or 50, and then went to Cordova. And since that time, I've been at churches that ranged in size anywhere from that to 1,100 or so. Now, the dynamics of established churches are different based on size. But there's one thing that's true about all of them. They're full of ordinary people. First church I preached for, a little place in Barlow, Kentucky, about 40 miles outside of Mayfield, Kentucky, where I was born and raised. And I don't know, have any of y'all ever been over there in Mayfield? It's just south of Paducah, about 25 miles south of Paducah over there. We started wearing shoes over there about 5 years ago. It's a big deal. Little church in Barlow, Kentucky. It was an old mill town that had been pretty large and bustling during a time when those lumber mills and other things were so much a big part of an economy. But you know, the community itself had gone down, and they had about 15 members, 15, 16, 17 members, and their ministry was training young preachers, giving us an opportunity to come and preach. And I was one of 10 young ministers who had gone out from the Northside Church of Christ in Mayfield, which at the time I was growing up in, it was about 500 or 600 people. And I was one of about 10 preachers who had gone to cut my teeth at Barlow or Cunningham Church. Those were the two churches that sort of gave young preachers an opportunity to learn how to preach. And it was an illustrious church of 15, 16, 17 members. I remember one, Brother Bradley. Brother Bradley was the treasurer. He's one of 3 men who were members of that church. And since he wrote my checks, I got to know him pretty well. And Brother Bradley had a hard time staying awake during my sermons. And also his teeth kind of bothered him a little bit. So sometimes before he'd take his nap, he'd take out his teeth and just sort of lay them right there beside him on the pew. And one day I said something in the sermon that startled him, and he'd been back, and I startled him at left arm. It swooped right down, and there were those teeth, and shoo! There those teeth went, floor just like this. They just clacking up that floor all the way up to the front of that building. And all this was happening while I was preaching. There's this lady sitting up in one of those front pews, and she looks down, and she sees that's Brother Bradley's teeth. I don't know how she knew they were Brother Bradley's. It was just a set of teeth. And she said, well, he's going to need his teeth. So she gets a tissue out of her purse, and she just reaches down, and she picks them up and passes them back from pew to pew until they find their way back to Brother Bradley. He just pops those teeth in his mouth, and great big old smile. It's an ordinary church full of ordinary people, and you got folks just like that in your church. How many of you have a brother thermostat at your church? One? Okay. How many of you have the peppermint man? All right, you know what I'm talking about? Those are established churches full of ordinary people, but God does extraordinary things in these churches. The kind of churches that you and I are a part of. Established churches have been my life. And so I've tried to spend a significant amount of time doing some reading and trying to draw from my experience as well as the experience of others, and trying to find what seemed to be the common philosophical shifts and practices that help established churches get beyond stuck. Now, I want to be real careful with this because I'm not a believer in what I call weekend wondering church growth or church revitalization. No one has all the answers to this. No one does. I don't. All churches are so different. And I don't want to give you the impression that I'm giving you a recipe, that if you go and you put it in the pot at your church, you're going to come out with this wonderful church soup. I'm not suggesting that at all. These are, however, some more common philosophical shifts and practices that revitalized congregations seem to have in common. And so that's the reason I mentioned them. And I normally like to present this over like a 6-session workshop, which is part of the reason why there are so many pages here. And I'm not going to be able to cover anywhere near everything that's on these sheets. So let me first just overview everything that's here on the first page, and I'll tell you what I'll be doing from that point. Do you see that little chart toward the bottom? Perspective and then philosophy. All right. It seems to me, perspective-wise, these 8 things tend to happen among revitalized established churches. And these 3 philosophies tend to play themselves out. Let me briefly go over these 8 perspectives and 3 philosophies. Then we'll camp out on a few of them because everything on the next few pages develops the perspective and philosophies. Okay? Perspective-wise, it seems that revitalized established churches have to realize that they are indeed in a mission field. But then, number 2, to maintain hope in that realization. For a church to become better, you have to focus on health and hope and not disease and death. That's what healthy people do. It's what healthy organisms do. They focus on health. And then number 3, as part of that, recognizing that you're in a mission field and maintaining hope, engaging cultural shifts proactively as mission opportunities, rather than crying and whining about them or hand-wringing about them. And then number 4, and this is probably one of the most significant changes that has to occur, is keeping the mission, maturation, and ministry of the church at the forefront in decision making. That is a major shift that has to occur. And then usually, once you do number 4, and that usually takes, some pretty significant mental and spiritual gymnastics to do number 4, then number 5 comes into play. Churches start changing. I know you've probably heard the old joke about how many Church of Christ elders it takes to change a light bulb. Change? What do you mean, change? We don't change around here. Okay. Don't you dare let those deacons change that light bulb. Okay. Change has to occur. And I suggest in that respect to encourage proponents with progress, because you don't want to lose your change proponents. To a very great extent, they're the life of your congregation. And then to assure the fearful with boundaries, that while some things change, there are some things that don't change. And guide all with good process. Then, number 6, in connection with all of this, usually there is a concern that if there are things that are changing within the church, some people don't like it. And so out of interest for unity, we sometimes fail to pursue mission. Now, are you following me there? And so that's why I suggest pursue unity in the context of progress, not in the place of progress. Unity and mission have to be viewed concurrently, not as antitheses to each other. When we use unity as a way of saying, well, there's a piece of mission we really can't pursue, then I think unity is misunderstood, as well as when we use mission in a way that is disrespectful of unity. In fact, I think the two are so intricately connected in Scripture that you really can't separate them. And then, number 7, to bless the past and to affirm living traditions, but to challenge complacency and happy talk. And I'm borrowing a phrase there from John Cotter. He's one of my favorite authors relative to large-scale change in organizations. In fact, some of the best change processes I've read regarding churches, they have simply baptized John Cotter. I've used a lot of his 8-stage process for a major change, and while there's some variation, you'll find that most of those things are there. And I don't borrow his process in here because it really takes longer to talk about than one small workshop can do. But one of the things he talks about is how that established churches, especially established churches that have held their own for a while, have a few things that they have done well in the past, and they sometimes let the momentum of that past shape their perspective as to what's currently happening. And that's called happy talk, where things are purported as being better than they really are, and it's difficult to get a truthful picture of what's actually happening. Those of us who do consulting, we often get what I call the hitman calls, where someone is calling us as a member of a church or a church leadership, where they want us to come in and do a diagnostic and give everybody the real truth as to what's going on. And the perspective is that, we're the guys with the briefcases from out of town, so we get to come in and tell people the truth and then leave. And, I have to admit I've done it a time or two, but I've never really felt good about it. I don't like doing that with churches. But you'll have people in these happy talk churches who realize we need somebody to just tell us the truth about what's going on with our congregation. And they'll want you to come in and do a, quote, diagnostic or a church checkup or some kind of, most of the time it's, can you recommend a survey? Any of you ever wanted to do a church survey? Okay. Those things aren't bad, but most of the time when people call me and say, would you come and do a church survey? I usually ask, why do you want it? And what are you going to do with it? If I do it, I just realize that it upsets the apple cart when you do diagnostics. I like to operate with strengths-based models rather than deficiency-based models anyway. And those diagnostics tend to be very deficiency-based in terms of what's wrong with your congregation. Usually I think there's enough right with a church that we can build on it, but happy talk is a different thing altogether. And you have to challenge complacency and happy talk. And then, Number 8, of course, consult good resources for benchmarks on church effectiveness, which is kind of an ongoing thing for church leaders to keep that going. And then, philosophically, I would suggest these 3 things to be both missional and attractional, which if we have time to get to that, we will. Missional means you go out. Attractional means you bring them in. I really think that's a false dichotomy that's being used in a lot of our churches. I mean, I hear people talking about wanting to be missional, and I think, yes, I agree, that's right. We got to go out. And they say, we're not interested in being attractional. And I think, well, what are you going to do? Be unattractional? I'm not following that. I mean, if you're already doing some things, then by all means, do them really, really well. And think about people who could potentially be attracted to what you already do, and remove whatever barriers there might be there to them being attracted to your church for the kinds of things that you're operating with. It's not uncommon for us to experience periods in congregational history and church history where the new and exciting is sometimes put forward as the solution to what already is. And sometimes missional is being put forward as the solution to the problem, which was attractional. And I'm saying, I don't know that attractional was as big a problem as we say it was. I think that sometimes we wanted to attract people. The attractional model is, if you build it, they will come. If you do this, people will be attracted to your church. All right, there is good and bad to that. I understand that. But we don't need to throw that out just in order to be missional. You can do both. You can both bring people in and go out. And I always get it mixed up as to which one of those is centripetal and centrifugal. But, you know, and I'm afraid to use that term because some of you engineers would correct me right away. But one of them is coming in and the other's going out. And you guys who know it better than I. All right. And then, number 2, to choose a method of church development and to be intentional and consistent with it. And then at the very least, follow a simple 3-dimensional model, which if we get there, I'll have time to present that. So, in the next few minutes before 5:15 dinner time, let me try to cover numbers 1 through 6 that are on the next 10 pages. Obviously, I'm not going to have time to do that. But let me try to hit on some highlights. And then, you know, there's a lot that is written here that will hopefully be helpful for you if you want to do some more reading. And I've also tried to document some sources at the bottoms of the pages if you'd like to do a little more reading. All right, now, in this first one, however, is this the way to do it? Number 1, I'm suggesting that we understand that we are in a mission field. All right, now, you probably have heard the statistic that says 40% of Americans attend church. Gallup has been saying that for many years. In fact, one study that was done by David Olson, as well as probably others that could be pointed to on this, has indicated that there hasn't been a whole lot of change among Gallup's figures for the past 60 or 70 years. They've all been kind of the same. But I don't know about you, but there aren't as many people going to church in my community as there were 50, 60, 70 years ago. There has to be something different. Well, I think he did some study that's probably a little more accurate that indicates that nationwide, I think it's somewhere around 17.7%, he says, attend a church on any given weekend. That's based on actual counts. In Tennessee, it's around 24%. Now, what that means is we're living in a culture that is increasingly unchurched, unreached. It's real easy to live in a place like South Knoxville, where we lived for 12 or 13 years, where when you go and you see people at Walmart or wherever, they greet you with and then see you off with "Have a blessed day," and then you see them wearing crosses and that sort of thing. It's just easy to assume in that kind of context, as well as perhaps here in West Virginia and Ohio, that you have a whole lot of Christian people. But the reality is we're living in a place where Jesus just simply isn't in the consciousness of most of the people who live and walk the streets and live in our homes. We are in a mission field. Now, in that respect, and I'm moving, see, very quickly from number one to number two. To number two, to maintain hope in this context. Ken Callahan is someone I still enjoy reading. I think Ken Callahan was missional before missional was cool. And he's in his 70s now, still has a lot of really worthwhile stuff to say. One of his best books, in my opinion, is Effective Church Leadership. And if you haven't read a good old book on church leadership in a while, I'd recommend you read it. It's a very, very fine text. I love what he says here. Be at peace. The current decline and demise of the established church is God's way of helping. I'm not proposing that we blame God for the loss of members. God's not at fault. But it's also clear that God has not intervened to stop the loss and decline. We should be wiser and more thoughtful than we have been. The loss and the decline should be teaching us something. The ways in which we've been doing leadership are no longer working on the mission field on which we now find ourselves. In a very clear sense, I think this is God's way of teaching us that what we've been doing no longer works. Ultimately, we will continue to lose members until we finally figure that out. I'm convinced that the church is at its best on the mission field. Do not long for the return of the church culture, the peace and tranquility, the pleasant programs and endless committee meetings of a church culture. Church is not where the church is at its best. The church is at its blazing best on the mission field. On the mission field, the church is lean and strong and has courage and vision. In a church culture, church becomes lazy and weak and timid and cautious and bloated and bureaucratic. The understanding of the nature of leadership is reduced to the principle of coordination. And coordination becomes the front or the code word for caution. On the mission field, the church is at its blazing best. God has blessed us greatly by planting us on the mission field. That's a pretty strong statement, but it's also quite hopeful. And he's saying, don't long for those bygone days. You know, there is a lot of darkness in the world. There's no question there's a lot of darkness, and churches are losing ground in many ways. But what's the best way to deal with the darkness? Bark at it? You ever tried to scream a tidal wave backward? Or bark at a tornado? Say, stop in the name of all that is good and godly. Doesn't work. How do you deal with darkness? You shine the light. That's how we deal with darkness. That's how God deals with darkness. Let there be light. And there was light. And we're light shiners. Philip Yancey, in his interesting book, Church, Why Bother, which talks about his migration away from the church and his migration back to it, which is one of his best books, in my opinion, says, yes, the church fails in its mission and makes serious blunders precisely because the church comprises human beings who will always fall short of the glory of God. That is the risk God took. And anyone who enters the church expecting perfection does not understand the nature of that risk or the nature of humanity. Just as every romantic eventually learns that marriage is the beginning, not the end of the struggle to make love work, every Christian must learn that the church is also only a beginning. I also liked this statement from David Getz that appeared in Christianity Today a few years ago when he says, for all of its foibles, lousy preaching, political infighting, self-centered focus, stagnation, and a gaggle of special interest groups, the pokey local church is still the most fertile environment for spiritual development. In fact, there can be no genuine spiritual progress without a long-term attachment to a pokey local church. Disillusionment with one's church, then, is not a reason to leave, but a reason to stay and to see what God will create in one's life and in the pokey local church. What I perceive to be my needs. I need a church with a more biblical preacher who uses specific examples from real life. May not correspond to my true spiritual needs. Often, in fact, I'm not even tuned to my true spiritual needs. Thinking that I know my true spiritual needs is arrogant, narcissistic, and so American. Staying put as a life practice allows God's grace to work on the unsanded surfaces of my inner life. And he quotes here, 17th century French Catholic mystic Francois Fenelon wrote, "Slowly you will learn that all the troubles in your life, your job, your health, your inward failings are really cures to the poison of your old nature." And then, J.F. Powers once said, "This is a big old ship. She creaks, she rocks, she rolls, and at times she makes you want to throw up. But she gets where she's going, always has, always will, till the end of time, with or without you." And he was talking about the church. So, maintain hope. Now I realize hope is hard to maintain. I certainly understand that. It's part of the reason why you're here, is because you probably wanted some encouragement, some opportunity to network with other elders, to have a little infusion of hope, to have your tank filled. That's a good thing. By the way, I'm really glad you're here. This is exciting to see this many. I never thought as a preacher I'd say this, but it's really exciting to see all this many elders in one room. That's right. Okay. All right. Well, let me now move to this third one. And recognizing that we have to engage cultural shifts proactively as ministry opportunities. And sometimes that's a matter of reframing. You heard me talking about the way to deal with darkness is to shine the light. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. And what I've tried to do there in this chart that you find on page, what page is it? 4, is I've tried to think of just a few cultural currents. And I've put those on the left. But then in the right-hand side, I've offered, these are by no means the solution ways of looking at each of these cultural currents, but it's a stab in the right direction. It's designed to say there are ways of reframing this and looking at them as missional opportunities. And let's think for just a moment about spiritual resurgence. There is a spiritual resurgence in our culture. Now, it's attributed to a whole lot of various factors, but spirituality is in. Now, God is not necessarily, but spirituality is really in. People are seeing the value of the spiritual. Now, it may get a number of different dresses on it. It could be Christian Scientism that people are attracted to, or the resurgence of interest in Buddhism. There's who was it? Scott Peck, who said he found his way to Jesus through Buddha. We could look at several others who, just listen to Oprah. I mean, Oprah's very into spirituality. Not necessarily in a Christian spirituality, in a Christian formation, the way we would think of it. Is there a way of thinking of that? Perhaps it is to revive the emphasis on the God who wants all to reach out for Him and find Him with the assurance that He is not far from any one of us, and who promises His divine presence to those who ask and seek and knock. And perhaps to direct seekers' spiritual longings toward the one God and away from the hollow and deceptive philosophies that give the appearance of wisdom but fail to lead one to God's fullness in Christ. It's interesting, isn't it, that in what we often refer to as a very religiously syncretistic environment, that's exactly the environment in which the New Testament was birthed. I mean, you read Ephesians, you read Colossians particularly. I have just really been drawn to the New Testament letter of Colossians in the last couple of years, especially with those marvelous doctrinal statements about the supremacy of Christ. And those letters were written partly because Paul was dealing with a group of people whose theology had become kind of a hodgepodge, a loose collection of ideas. As described in Ephesians, they were tossed back and forth by every wind of teaching. And so he tries to take them back to the centrality of Christ. And that's why you have statements in Colossians, which is many of them verbal parallels in Ephesians, where Christ is described as the fullness of God. And the fullness of deity dwelt in him bodily. There's just so much to draw from because the New Testament was written to an environment very similar to what you and I are now experiencing. It isn't a reason to whine and long for the old days and to hand-wring and to fret, but to say, wow, there are all kinds of theological resources tucked into Scripture for this very thing. What about religious pluralism, which is kind of connected to this spiritual resurgence? Perhaps it's a good opportunity for us to convey the uniqueness of Christianity in an evangelistic sequence of demonstration, living it, dialogue, respectfully exchanging viewpoints with others, then declaration, clearly articulating the truth, and defense, answering the challenges and roadblocks to understanding and acceptance. I'm encouraged by some groups that are seemingly doing a pretty good job with this. If you have not, I would encourage you to listen to the preaching of Tim Keller. If you want a pretty good example of what it means to observe this evangelistic sequence in an actual church somewhere. Tim is the preacher for Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. And go to his website, read some of his books, poke around his website, and if you can find it, sometimes it's a little hard to find, listen to his little 5-minute audio vignettes where he's answering actual questions about biblical morality and other things from some people who are really pretty worldly and have just recently been converted, which is a lot of the folks who are a part of his church. Listen to the way he answers those questions, to the way he conveys Scripture to those people. And you realize, oh my, if this man can do this in New York City, and certainly we can do it in Parkersburg and Marietta and Belpre and Memphis and so on. I was really drawn to, somebody pointed it out to me a few years ago, and I went and actually started listening to the way he does this, and I thought, it can happen. That it's possible to preach a very strongly biblical message, observing biblical authority in much of the same way that you and I would interpret biblical authority. And honestly, the message that he would convey in most of those subjects would be not much different, if different at all, than what we would convey. And just to listen to the way he does that, and you would probably walk away from that feeling pretty encouraged and realize this can happen. It's really possible to reach people. And we've got some people within the larger evangelical world who are doing it, but are almost bullying people with it, and I don't encourage that. I don't want to mention a lot of names in that respect, but I think we do have some, kind of bullying evangelism that's happening, and the big church cultures are being formed by it. And I think on the other hand, you've got sort of the Joel Osteen approach that is, I don't mind saying it. It's a very watered down gospel, if a gospel at all. But somewhere in between that, there, on this continuum, there is a way of being able to preach a solidly biblical, Judeo-Christian message, and to do it in a way that truly reaches those in whom God is working and to whom He is leading. And I could mention, people like Tim Keller and people like even Francis Chan and some others that just listen to them, read through their books, and you can see there is indeed a way of articulating a solidly Christian message in this culture. Don't grow weary of it. Name Lynn Anderson, ring a bell, okay? Smell Like Sheep, all these other books. I was just so impressed one time when some of us were sitting down listening to him, and he talked about how he had essentially remade himself at least 4 times in his adult ministry. Remade himself. Where he had to completely rethink the way he was doing things. Well, maybe we're living in one of those remaking times. Okay. Radical skepticism. What about it? Perhaps that helps us to renew Jesus' emphasis on the embodied apologetic of authentic living, beauty in human relationships, and the new humanity that breaks down the barriers of race and ethnicity and economic status or gender, to defend Christian teachings with the humility of spiritual wisdom and graceful speech and respectful answers. Isn't that kind of what we were supposed to already be doing anyway? And it sort of underscores that for us. And then, what about us living in the post-Christendom, or as some like to call it, the post-Constantinian era? Although I think Constantine is blamed for an awful lot that he never really did. What about perhaps reliving the history of the early church that thrived when it was marginalized? Is it possible for the church to thrive when it's marginalized? Sure. Recognize where we've maybe relied too heavily on governmental protection or cultural privilege, and replace it with apostolic reliance on the power of the Holy Spirit to send us to the most receptive peoples and places. Perhaps to reclaim our identity in Christ as a holy nation that spans earthly boundaries, that will one day stand before the throne of God as a great multitude that no one can count, from every nation and tribe and people and language. What about moral relativism? Boy, there's a lot of it in our culture, isn't there? There really is. Perhaps it gives us an opportunity to present biblical morality as more than rules to keep, to elevate the meaning and the beauty of ethical principles, and by explaining their theological and their relational and covenantal and spiritual foundations. What about uncritical tolerance that is within our culture? Well, perhaps it's an opportunity for us to imitate Jesus' hospitality and unconditional love with sinners, while maintaining biblical discernment and healthy moral boundaries, to relate to others through the framework of unconditional love and truth-bearing, not through the critical eye of self-righteous distance. Now, this is it's just an attempt. You know, I just sat down one day and produced a little chart. It's just the beginning. Hopefully it's good fodder that could get us each thinking in these terms and realizing that, yes, we're living in an increasingly unchurched culture. And it's probably going to take a long time, if that ever is turned the other way. Who knows? But do we need to despair in that context? No, I would say let's maintain hope and let's engage cultural shifts proactively as mission opportunities. Seems to me that established churches that are revitalized have these components prospectively that are a part of their lives. And then number 4. Now, I'm going to have to spend quite a bit of time with this, and I'm glad I've got this wealth of 15 minutes to do it. Number 4. Guys, this is really, really strong. Keeping the mission, the maturation, and the ministry of the church at the forefront in decision making. I have just moved from teaching to meddling. I'm crossing the boundary, okay? So, pull up your big boy shorts. Talking to you elders. In other words, just realize I'm about to say some things that may hurt a little bit. They hurt me. Please beware of the illusion of congregational happiness. I'm borrowing a term there from Gil Rendle. At the risk of overstatement, hang in here with me. The driving force behind most leadership decisions in established churches is holding down complaints and pursuing what Gil Rendle calls the illusion of congregational happiness. Here's how it plays out. The leaders of the congregation want to make some needed changes in the worship assembly. They realize no matter which route they choose, significant individuals or groups in the congregation will be unhappy. Stop right there. You ever been there? Done that? Okay, all right. Fearing stiff resistance either way they go, the leaders freeze, sometimes for years. I won't ask for a show of hands, but how many of your churches are there right now? Okay, no, I didn't ask. You don't have to hold up your hand. Okay, all right. This inertia increases congregational anxiety. One group wants movement, is upset about the stalemate. Another group fears change and is anxious about the slippery slope that could be around the corner. Okay, I know, I hear people say all the time, I don't believe in the slippery slope. Whether you believe in it or not, you got a lot of members who do. I never will forget, well, this is a classic example of the slippery slope. I can't remember what change we made. I really can't, because what this guy said to me just stuck so firmly in my mind I couldn't remember anything else. But the elders had made some kind of change, and I can't remember what it was. I was standing in the lobby, and I got lobbied. You ever been lobbied? Vestibuled? Narthexed? Okay, whatever you call it. Narthex sounds like a bug part. I've never understood why they call it narthex. Probably goes back to some medieval something or other. Who knows? No, I actually do know the etymology of the word, but nonetheless, you get lobbied. Okay. And he came out and he said, "Oh, I can't believe them elders decided they were going to do that for you. You know, we're going to have lesbian elders at this church." And I said, "Where is that coming from?" I thought, you know, what does serving the Lord's Supper from the back of the auditorium have to do with that? You know, I don't get the connection. But boy, I mean, he was on that slippery slope, and whoo, there we were going. All right. Now, so everyone observes the no-talk rule about the issues, fearing that, well, if we bring that up, it'll make some folks unhappy. Church members dance around each other's real concerns, practicing a fellowship of shallow church chat. It's like a gathering of porcupines doing a strange religious dance. Believers come together and waltz around the vestibule, come just close enough to feel each other's quills, and then they back off whenever the discussion starts going where everyone knows we don't go. So it's this, do, 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 do. You know, we don't talk about anything. Then comes the elusive elders' meetings. Some of our people are saying, you know, that will upset so-and-so. And they become the all-sufficient force to bring discussion to a halt. Quelling complaints and keeping them from occurring become the measuring sticks of church effectiveness. Now let me stop here for just a moment. Let's extend some kindness to this. Those of you who become elders at your churches, you get appointed as an elder because people know you, right? They love you, and you love them. And then you find out how your relationships with the people in the church change after you become an elder. And how difficult it is sometimes to maintain friendships with people you've known for 15, 20, 25, 30 years. Just because you made a decision they didn't like. And you find you don't get invited to a Sunday after dinner at S&S cafeteria. Or you didn't get invited to the Labor Day party like you always have over the past several years. Or some other kind of social exclusion. You know, that hurts. It hurts, doesn't it? It hurts to have somebody whom surely they know how much you love them. But because they made a decision you didn't like, they chew you out in the hallway or in the lobby. And they're not your friend anymore. We preachers sometimes grow a little weary with that. I'll admit that we do, because most of us have a different kind of relationship with our churches. It's not quite the same as the way elders relate to their churches. But a big change occurred in me personally when I started sitting on the pew end rather than the pulpit end of the church. And I really did begin to see things differently, and I realized what an incredible struggle it is for many of our elders to deal with this, and how easy it is for them to slip into this pleasing posture. You don't become an elder because you like to upset people. If you liked to upset people, you wouldn't have become one. In fact, they wouldn't have appointed you. Right? So I understand where this comes from. I really do. And I'll be honest, if I were an elder at a church where I already had a history of 15, 20, or 25 years, it would be hard for me to make unpopular decisions. And anyone who can't say that's just not being honest about it. It is hard. But sometimes it helps to look at this more objectively and to come away from it and say, okay, what does it really accomplish? Okay? Joe Rendell suggests that this happiness trap hurts the congregation in at least 3 ways. He says, number 1, he says, we practice only the parts of our faith that we enjoy or appreciate, which assumes we're already where we need to be spiritually. And this constrains the Spirit of God by not allowing us to grow and change in needed areas. Number 2, he suggests, we preserve stability and status quo by reducing the evaluations of our effectiveness to whether or not we have complaints. If we have no complaints, everything is fine. And if we have complaints, we eliminate the problems by returning to the status quo where the happiness overrides the complaints. And number 3, he says, we focus the attention and energy of the congregation internally and avoid or ignore the call to external ministry. Paradoxically, efforts to stop complaints are actually self-defeating. They actually create opportunities for additional and competing complaints from those who feel differently than the satisfied party. For example, if you try to address complaints about the lack of genuine community by allowing the minister to shift his time to developing small groups, new complaints will emerge that he's not available to make hospital visits. What's the best response? Freeze? No. Again, inertia creates as many complaints as action. The truth is, there's no way to stop complaints. Underscore that, highlight it. There's no way to stop complaints. Thus, the illusion of congregational happiness. And again, I'm borrowing here from Rendell. The best response is to move the emphasis away from fixing complaints and prioritize decisions based on a strong sense of congregational purpose. The key words here are priority and emphasis. This is not to suggest a false dichotomy between being missional and making people happy. No, we have psychological categories for people who enjoy making people unhappy. We're not suggesting that, okay? These are often compatible interests. The problem arises when mission loses priority. And the chart below illustrates the principle. Focus less on pleasing the preferences of your members by asking questions like, who wants what, and how do we satisfy a person or a group, or what should we do about this complaint, to focus more on what does Scripture call us to be and do. What are we called to do in this chapter of our history as a congregation? What are the goals and objectives that we set out to accomplish in our ministry? What are the appropriate strategies for our ministry, and how will we measure their attainment, and so on? But let's say this shift is made. Leaders have to remember that making this shift brings even more complaints. The temptation is to return to soothing others' pain by anxiously adjusting decisions until happiness is restored. I call this adjusting the shower water. When we turn on the shower and the water's first too hot or too cold, we go through several adjustments until we find just the right temperature. You can do it with water, but trying to do it with people brings 3 results. 1, it destroys leadership trust in those who favored your original decision. 2, it destroys leadership credibility even among those who know they can manipulate you back into their perspective. And number 3, it trains the members to get what they want by complaining. Underscore number 3. Sometimes the response you get is the message you sent. If you don't want complaints, but you keep on responding to the complaints, then you're training your members to get what they want by complaining. How many of you have raised kids? Raised teenagers? We practice this with our teenagers, right? Especially with our small children and others, that if they bicker and whine and complain and yell and scream and pitch a fit, if we're training them right, and we don't just give them stuff because we're exasperated ourselves, we'll say, you're not going to get what you want by pitching a fit. You're going to have to change your way of approaching it here. Well, sometimes we do the same thing, though, with our churches. We give people what they want when they misbehave. And so, in reality, we're encouraging misbehavior when we do that. Rendell suggests, instead of this, a threefold response of principled presence. He's actually borrowing some here from emotional systems as well. But he suggests this three-pronged approach. Let me see if I've got a slide on that. I can't remember whether I do or not. Nope, I don't. So it's here on paper. See this right here? Middle of page 6 is where I am. This is what he suggests. Number 1, stay connected. This involves both listening and talking. First, listen to everyone, including complainers, in order to understand congregational concerns. And this can include listening to those who even represent others, inviting focus groups to meet with the elders, convening systematic listening groups, etc. And second, talk and inform members of the what and why of the decisions. Always tie actions to the overall purpose and challenge the people with the church's mission. And then number 2, as you stay connected, maintain a clear and reasoned position. Rendell says people have a right to be heard, but they do not hold a mandate to be accommodated. If leaders have addressed the higher purpose questions mentioned in the right side of the chart above, they will be able to articulate their positions in terms of purpose and not personal agenda or politics. And then number 3, to resist anxious reactivity. To allow people to adjust to changes and realize that they may not always be at their best behavior. Do not fight back. Be consistent in your communication with all interested parties. Don't take it personally. Listen without caving to dissent, and even keep a sense of humor. Help people through the chaotic wilderness into the new and better realities that your decisions are aimed at unfolding. One piece of this last one, number 3, in resisting anxious reactivity, I'm working with a church now to where they're trying to determine what they're going to do about a major controversial issue among our churches. And the issue has arisen among them, and so they're doing what they can to try to make some good decisions about it. And one of the things I've encouraged them to do is to make their decision on a principled basis, but then to do 2 different types of anticipations, as I've called them. One is, I call it anxious anticipations. That they need to make a list of every imaginable negative response given to them in the most negative and hurtful way possible, and lay them all out on the table. And just come and just give them out. Give them out in their eldership. Just give them out. Just shoot them back and forth to each other. And say them in the most ungodly and unkind ways that they can be said. And then train yourself in how you're going to respond to them. Actually coach each other in how you're going to respond to those things. Guys, that pays off rich dividends. I mean, it really, really does. Really does. But also encourage them to have a second type of anticipation that are called pastoral anticipations. In making a list of all the people they knew who would have major faith struggle with the decision that they make. Make a list of them, and then assign some shepherd couples to be watching those people like hawks, and to make a beeline to them when you see that their difficulties are rising, to listen to them, to help them along, to shepherd them along with this new change, this different thing that's going to be occurring within the church. And when you do that, it helps you to control anxious reactivity. I don't know about you, but your degree of reactivity always goes back to the emotional wiring you received in your family of origin. It always goes back to that. Now, we may learn some better reflexes through our adult lives, but it always goes back to that. Now, I have to admit, my wiring wasn't great. It was not. The wiring I got was enough to turn the lights on, but also enough to create a lot of okay? And I've worked most of my adult life trying to learn better ways of responding to anxious occurrences in my life. I need rehearsal sometimes. I have to have rehearsal. And as elders, sometimes we have to have that too. When we know we're going to be facing a lot of anxious responses, sometimes it's just really, really good to give them back and forth to each other before the heat gets on, so we can learn and interact with each other and coach each other. And what's the best response? Anxious anticipations, pastoral anticipations. And sometimes that's a way of being able to quell our own anxious reactivity and to be able to prepare for it. so that we do not constantly plague our church with this illusion of congregational happiness and always trying to go the path of least resistance. Because often a path of least resistance creates no positive transformative change among our people. And real leaders have to be willing to challenge their churches, to change in ways that are good. All right. Well, it's 5:16. I've gone over 1 minute, which is less than I have gone over my allotted time in a long time. I really feel good. I mean, I'm standing here feeling really good about myself right now, just looking at that clock and realize, oh, it's 5:17. Boy, and dinner is at 5:30. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? Am I remembering that right? Or is it right now? Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I'm feeling great. I'm feeling really good because I get to talk to you while you're eating. So I get to continue this, see? So I think we're going over there now to eat. Is that right?